or high, today, right now, you are in the right place. There is a power for good in the universe. It is within you, and you can use it. My name is Reverend Francis Lee. I am your presider for today because Marla is taking some well-deserved time off. As a spiritual leader, Thanksgiving and Christmas and all the things that happen in there, that's a whole lot that's going on. And because Marla had really nothing else to do, she decided to go ahead and create a workshop, retreat, which some of you went to. Who attended that? Okay, so would you folks like to stand? If you attended the last week's retreat, would you please stand? And was it a wealthy, as it were, wonderful experience for you? Okay, so all of you who are seated, take a look at all of those who are standing, okay? And you might want to grab them for a couple of minutes and chat with them to see what was the experience that gave them value, okay? So that the next time Reverend Marla offers a retreat, you too may consider it thoughtfully. Thank you. Okay, before I get to the reading, we have a very special guest. This speaker today, I'm going to call you a fixture. I think you've been a fixture in the New Thought movement over here, probably in the last couple of decades. I've listened to him at a number of different churches speaking. I've attended at least 2 of his different classes, and if spirituality was a pool, our guest speaker, Reverend Michael Bogart, he goes to the deep end and he jumps in. Okay, and he invites you through his talks, through his workshops, to dive in with him. He is the spiritual director at the Bainbridge Island Spiritual Enrichment Center, which is a community for soul making. He is also an adjunct instructor in world religions at Central Texas College on the Lewis McChord base in Tacoma, and he teaches regularly throughout the Northwest. His work as a minister, retreat leader, public speaker, and writer underscores soul making as a dynamic process that values both positive and negative emotions as normal, what a concept, and necessary. Michael integrates mythology, theology, personal spirituality, practical philosophy, and depth psychology into his spiritual blender, and we get to drink the nourishment found in his soul-making teaching. Lucky us. So when it comes time for him to come up and speak, give him a nice warm Unity of Bellevue welcome, please. Okay, so for today's reading, we are in The Flow of Life by Eric Butterworth. Life is lived from within out. If you look for security or harmony or cooperation on the outside, you quickly become irritated with coworkers or family members or complete strangers who do not cooperate, who are too demanding, and who are careless and indifferent. What can be done? Get into the flow. Whatever the conditions may be, or the caliber or character of the people with whom you must work and live and interact with, the important thing is you are there. It is good to affirm, wherever I am, there let me be. This means be a channel for the flow of the infinite creative process. If you get and stay in the flow, you will not let the attitudes and antics of other persons squeeze you into their mold. You will let the spirit within you sustain you with all that you need of love and understanding, and of the ideas and creativity to do your work well and to be a bigger person in the process. Thank you, Eric Butterworth. And now we have today's affirmation. I'll read it for you first, and then I'll ask you to stand and join me. I live in the flow of life. confident that all is well in the mind of God, so all is well in my life now. Every doubt is immediately converted to certainty. Every fear is effortlessly converted to faith. As I live in the flow of life, my abiding sense of happiness and peace permeates my being, and I live my best year yet. And so it is. Please stand and read with me. I live in the flow of life, confident that all is well in the mind of God. So all is well in my life now. Every doubt is immediately converted to certainty. Every fear is effortlessly converted to faith. As I live in the flow of life, an abiding sense of happiness and peace permeates my being, and I live my best year yet, and so it is.
Beautiful. Good morning. Every time I hear somebody say that I'm going to go deep, I always think of get the shovel. Thank you for that nice introduction. No, seriously. Thank you. And if my wife were to allow to give the dark side of the introduction, it would be a little different than that. And we all have both, don't we? And that's part of the reason for this talk this morning in the class that Reverend Marla has asked me to do here. What's the title of the class? I forget what title I gave her. Does anybody know? Say it again. Metaphysical Bible? Wow. The title I like to use is Watching God Grow Up, reading the Bible as stages of consciousness. And let me share just a little bit about my own spiritual story and then how I have come to see, I believe that story coincides with the bigger story called the Hebrew Christian Bible. I was raised in a home with no religion whatsoever. Wasn't anti-religion, wasn't pro-religion, it just was what it was. At the age of 19 and a half, my second year of college, my parents both became born-again Christians, which was very odd because my dad was an alcoholic, very successful businessman, but alcoholic, and my mom took care of him. And so it was this very effed up relationship. Can I say effed up here? Is that okay? All right. So it was a very screwed up relationship, and suddenly it changed. So there was a spiritual transformation of both of my parents, and so I retired to my bedroom and read through the Gospel of Matthew a few weeks later privately just to see what the hell had happened with these people. A book I'd never really didn't know. I knew nothing about the Bible. I read through the Gospel of Matthew in 3 successive evenings, and when I got to the conclusion and read about the arrest and the trial and the crucifixion and the resurrection and that whole story, nothing impressed me that much. But after I finished the story, I laid the little green Gideon New Testament. Remember when they used to pass those out back in the Civil War days in the schools? I laid it aside on the dresser, and something came over me. Literally, something came over me. It wasn't audible, but it was clear, and it said, believe. And I remember asking, believe what? And it said it again, believe. And I folded my hands because I saw them do this on television shows, on the religious shows. So I folded my hands and I said, I believe. And long story, make it very short, the next morning I got up, went outside to get in my car to go to college classes, which by the way, I had a 1.5 grade point average. So I was spending most of my time partying and doing anything but college work. Anyway, I was walking out to the car and I looked up into the sky and stopped frozen because all of a sudden the whole cosmos came together like a multi-pieces puzzle, and it all made sense. And I was a piece of that puzzle, or that big puzzle, and I fit into it, and it was so clear, and my whole life changed. My grade point went from 1.5 to 3.8. I called my friends and said, I'm not going to go partying anymore. They said, you'll be fine. You got a hangover. You'll get over it. I said, no, and everything changed. I went to a Christian college, went to 2 different seminaries, and became a minister, And in that process, which took a few years, I found myself starting to question everything that I was being taught. And the questioning ate me up. At first, it was this spiritual experience where the presence of the Christ was palpable. I mean, it was the most real thing I'd ever experienced. And then it went to doubt and questioning and turmoil. And most of it I did privately, even as a minister in a church back in the 80s, very young minister, very young, get that? I had lots of doubts about the whole thing, and I finally left it. About 1990. And I came over, and this was one of the first places I visited, because somebody said, well, those lunatics over there, they're a little different. And I said, I don't want any more church. I don't want anything to do with church. I've had it with church. And I went out and started building houses. But I came over here when they had, what was his name? The musical ministry guy. Charles King. Came over here, and I remember sitting right over here and watching the lunatics do weird lunatic things here and thinking, this is a little different. They were singing Beatles songs in church. And Charles called me up to sing. I was like, hell no, I don't sing. He said, doesn't matter, nobody here sings. Come on up, and we're going to sing. So he brought me up to sing, and I thought, I'm not coming back here again. But I did, and I went over to the Religious Science Church, and Jim Munson, who was the minister there, I told him my whole story, the one I just shared with you, and he said, you'd fit right in here. Why don't you come to Seabeck and do a Bible class? I said, what the hell are you talking about? I said, I hate the Bible. He said, that's okay, a lot of people here hate the Bible. So I did. I went over and did this Bible class, and I've been doing Bible and many classes over there ever since, and I've kind of just been adopted by the New Thought movement, and I've adopted it. And I often tell people, my dad's a fundamentalist, wonderful fundamentalist Christian, and he says, what are you doing with those people? And I said, they let me ask the questions that I couldn't ask when I was in the movement you're in. I said, I love and appreciate your movement. I do today. But I said, I just don't fit in there. I said, I can ask questions here. And that was sort of my journey. So here I am today speaking about the Bible. So I just want you to know, as I'm talking about this book called the Bible, I'm talking about it from this journey that I have just shared with you. And it's had many facets. Each of you in this room knows what I'm talking about by many facets, don't you? And as I began to read the Bible anew, I found myself looking at it and thinking, you know, this tells my story. It's a long narrative covering over 2,000 years. And there is a narrative. I tell people it's a little bit like reading Moby Dick. If you've ever read Moby Dick, you know that he goes off on tangents, and you go, what does this have to do with the story? And this does it as well. But there's a central thread that runs through the biblical narrative that we're going to be addressing in this class, and it is essentially what I call watching God grow up as you. Now, what God is, I do not know. Metaphysicians can do that, and we've got a lot of them. One person said to me one time, if you lined up all the metaphysicians in the world, it would be a good place to leave them. So the metaphysicians and philosophers and theologians can say what they will, and there's lots of opinions. But what I'm suggesting is that rather than study it metaphysically, in spite of the title, we're going to look at it as your spiritual journey. And it is a spiritual journey where God transmutes through the process. And the process, I think, goes something like this, and this will be the approach we use in class. I'm going to suggest that there are 4 main modes or stages in the biblical story, beginning in Genesis and ending in the last book of the New Testament, which is, come on, you ex-Baptists, what is it? Revelation. So from Genesis to Revelation, there is a whole story in many, many different kinds of books, and I believe that it can be broken into 4 different sections. And I'm going to illustrate it by using this little Russian nesting doll. And I'm going to suggest that the very first stage is found in the book of Genesis, and I call it the ego stage. It is the birth of the I. The great I am becomes a whole bunch of little I ams. I am that I am, coming out of the I am. So this shocks a lot of people, especially Course in Miracles people have come and talked to me and said, well, we don't like this. I say, that's okay. Because in the New Thought movement, guess what we're allowed to have? new thoughts. So I said, this is the ego stage. The characters in the book of Genesis are ego. Every one of them is very self-centered. That's fine, because we're all self-centered. It's fine to be self-centered until it's not. So, and I'm going to say that a lot in the class. So if you come to the class, get ready for it. It works until it doesn't. So Genesis is ego. Even the God of Genesis is an egoic being. It's all about God. He puts people in the garden. He kicks them out of the garden. Puts a tree there, says, don't eat from the tree. You're going to get in trouble. People start building a big tower, and God says, don't like this. I'm going to knock it down. So all through the book of Genesis, we find the characters and the God portraying an ego stage or mode of consciousness. And before we judge this God or these people, we look in the mirror and say, aha, that's me. Because every human being begins as a little I. We have to develop a personality, a self, a sense of vocation, a sense of I amness. And it is great until it's not. Because that, in my opinion, is the way it works. These modes of consciousness are incredibly valuable until they don't work anymore, and that's what pushes us over into the next stage. M. Scott Peck has this idea in The Different Drum. Those of you that have read that, in there he has a chapter titled The Stages of Faith. And in there he talks about 4 stages of faith, just as I think there are 4 stages in the Bible. Scott Peck says the first stage is chaotic, antisocial. The ego stage. Because the ego creates, by the end of its journey, creates lots of chaos and antisocial situations. If you've ever been around somebody, including yourself, where you're egoic nonstop, you know that chaos ensues. You alienate people, things fall apart. Scott Peck says that's necessary because that stage of growth gives you all you need until you need more. And that's where our little egoic nesting doll in the book of Genesis moves into a second stage of consciousness where the ego is not jettisoned. And I hear this sometimes. People keep saying things like, I need to get rid of my ego. I get that metaphor. I'm not condemning it. But I'm suggesting that biblically, you don't get rid of the ego. You bring it with you. I mean, I don't care how many of us have had spiritual experiences. Guess what we still have? Very powerful egos. And we can move, or I can move, from a very egoic, self-obsessive, self-centered attitude into spirituality. Every time I come into a church, I get real spiritual. You know what I'm saying? But at home, maybe not so spiritual. Well, I'm suggesting that even the ego in this view is spiritual. You see? But in the Bible, and Scott Peck says, the ego is assimilated, so we don't lose it, but we move into a second stage of spiritual growth, which comes in the book of Exodus, after Genesis. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all the way up to the books of Samuel, that whole section of the Bible is a second stage of spiritual growth. Because in Exodus, for those of you that know Exodus, what happens to all the different little people in Genesis? What do they become? The nation of Israel. They become a collective, a group, a party. And if there's anything that we know about today in America, it's partisan groups. This is a necessary stage of consciousness. So the second mode of consciousness in Exodus and several books after it adds something to the ego. It adds relationships. To be in relationship with myself is pathologizing eventually. We call it psychopathy, sociopathy, because you've got to be in relationships with others. So in the Bible, God grows from ego, the I am, to the we are. Sometimes I call the second stage we go. You see? Because typically it happens in adolescence where we fall in love, and suddenly the ego boundary, as Marianne Williamson says, romantic love is the most wonderful spiritual experience because my ego dissolves long enough to mesh with somebody else, and then it's all about us. Oh, after you. No, after you. Where do you want to go tonight? Oh, I don't care, as long as I'm with you. Wonderful. And it is wonderful, and it's necessary. This is where partisan politics come in. We find our group. We share their ideas. We call it groupthink, herd mentality. When it gets sick and dangerous, just as the ego does, when it gets sick and dangerous, it becomes the mob mentality. It turns to violence. It turns to us versus them. And lest any of us in this room think that we don't belong to one, let me just say one word: politics. There's nothing that can bring that egoic pathologizing to the surface like partisan politics. You understand what I'm saying? You know, when I left the conservative movement back in 1990, I thought, I'm going to come over to this New Thought movement where it's always love. They said it would be. And it's all unity. The sun will fly through the sky with wings, embracing all of humanity. And it does. That's definitely a big part of it. But we still bring our egos and our we-goes with us. We're still egocentric, yes? We're still we-go-centric. I'll never forget the first time I got together with a group of new thoughters at a retreat, and they all started talking about politics, and most of them were talking about those stupid Republicans. Now, there were a few Republicans still in the closet there, and they've really gone in the closet now. But they were there, and they would just kind of smile, most of them. Some left, but they just smiled, and they thought, well, this is just what we put up with here. So the we-go stage is in Exodus, where God becomes the nation of Israel. We all have to have relationships. In this class, we're going to explore ego as a mode of consciousness, how it helps, how it hinders. We're going to explore relationships when we get to Exodus and all through that section. How the relationships we're in are beneficial and divine and spiritual, even when there's difficulties. But and Scott Peck, by the way, calls this second stage formal institutional. He says when you're at the end of chaos and antisocial egoism, you start looking for structure and order, institutions, something you can count on. That's why we like to be in a relationship. We hope there's something there, whether it's a love relationship, a family, a tribe, a nation, a political party, whatever it is. We love that stage. But Scott Peck says that stage comes to an end. It must, because we're watching God grow up. Ego's good until it's not. We-go's good until it's not. The third stage of consciousness does not jettison ego or relationships. It brings both of those stages and modes with us. They'll never leave us. We always need relationships. We always need our ego. But it puts it into a third stage of consciousness that starts to show up in the book of Kings and the poetic books in the Old Testament and the prophetic books in the Old Testament. And that third stage of consciousness I call disintegration. Scott Peck calls it skeptic individuation. This third mode of consciousness requires that you have an ego. It requires that you have relationships, because things can't disintegrate until you have to have something to disintegrate. So in this view, every relationship we're in is going to disintegrate at some level. It has to. Otherwise, we would live happily ever after in utopian America or wherever in our relationships. And we all know that's not happening. So the third stage starts in the Kings, poetic books, prophetic books, and it is disintegration. Now, this is the stage that most New Thought churches do not like to discuss, because this includes all of those negative emotions. Do you understand? This is the stage. Let's just take a marriage. We could take anything, but let's take a marriage. You're in a relationship. You're married. You're going to live happily ever after. This is the person you just can't believe. You're so lucky to be with this person. And then move it down the road a few years. And many of us know this experience, so please don't look at your partner. But we know this experience of having that moment, or those moments when you wake up one morning or you're driving down the road in the car and you're looking at that person going, till death do us frickin' part. That's the beginning of disintegration. It's not bad. It's bad, but it's not bad. Do you understand? It is spirituality. In this view, every stage is a spiritual stage of growth. That's why Scott Peck calls them stages of spiritual growth. There comes that time in life where that thing, that job, that body, physical body, as I age, I look at the disintegration in the mirror. I have a relationship with this body that's disintegrating. Everything in this life that we're related to, the car, all have relationships with cars. That car is disintegrating. Have you noticed? Everything disintegrates. It must, in this view. Spirituality requires disintegrations. Somebody said to me, well, are you saying then that we should always divorce that person that we suddenly find ourselves not liking? No. I'm saying just recognize that that's going to fall apart. I had a woman in class one time who, when we talked about this, she raised her hand and she said, I've been married 6 times. And everybody gasped. She said, to the same man. Somebody said, you mean 6 different ceremonies? She said, hell no. I mean, we've been in 6 different relationships over the last 50 years. Because the initial relationship disintegrated, and we went through a period of thinking, I don't know if we're going to make it. Don't raise your hands, but you understand what I'm talking about. And then you find yourself either sticking with it or not, but if you stick with it and you're both working together, a new relationship develops. That's what I'm talking about. So this disintegration mode we're going to explore in some detail. This includes our addictions. What if our addictions are spiritual experiences? I'm in recovery. I understand this concept. What if our neuroses, all of Woody Allen's movies are stage 3 movies, relationships. He's a neurotic times 10. What if all of our neuroses and pathologies are part of the spiritual process? Every ancient culture, and we're going to look at this, and as well as the biblical Hebrew culture, every ancient culture saw the gods involved in the dissolution process, taking people apart to remake them. So in this view, the New Thought movement to me is very, very positive when it does what I call the positive power of negative thinking. Think about that for a minute. The positive power of negative thinking. What if we could look at our fears and our anxieties and our panic attacks and our depressions and these things that we don't dare talk about in church because that's not spiritual. What if we can start to look at them as divine presences? And that those divine presences are there with revelations, knocking at the door in the apocalypse, waiting for us to open the door during the apocalypse so we can let it come in and sup with us. Or Rumi's The House Guest. Are you familiar with that poem? If a negative emotion visits you, Rumi says, and knocks on your door, invite it in. Welcome them, even if they have overturned the furniture, because they may be there with a message from above. So that's stage 3. It's the most annoying stage. It's where the most suicides occur. It's where the most Prozac descriptions occur. It's a stage that we're going to look at as a spiritual stage. And then there's a 4th stage. Thank God. What do you think follows disintegration? Reintegration. In this view, faith is required in this stage 3 like no other stage. Because it's when the presence of God feels a million miles away. In fact, it's what the mystics called the presence of the absence of God. Drink that one in. In other words, the experience of absence in your anxieties, fears, depressions is an actual presence that in most mythologies, there is a divine absence that is present. But the 4th stage. We move to the 4th stage when we bring with us what? Our ego, our we-goes, and our neuroses. And we move into a 4th stage that Scott Peck calls the mystic communal stage. I call it the union stage. This symbol up here names stage 4. And most of our New Thought churches emphasize, and I say rightly so, stage 4. But we're going to look at the notion in this class that unless we have stages 1, 2, and 3, which most of us bring to our New Thought churches, but now hopefully we can bring them more confessionally and say, I come to this New Thought church because I need ego repair, I need relationship repair, and I need neurotic repair. You do know we're all insane, don't you? In varying degrees. We bring those insanities and all of that into the presence of the mystical. And the mystical stage is that stage where you know the presence of the good. This morning when you were doing your prayer, I felt that stage 4. I was a little in the kind of twilight neutral zone sitting there. And when you spoke your prayer and your words, I could feel that presence of the mystical come over me. This is good. This is stage 4. This is reintegration. This is where that person that has dissolved in the addiction or the depression or the fear or the divorce or the loss of a child, an experience I know, where you have fallen apart and all the puzzle pieces are just in a massive mess, and the infinite puts them back together again, sometimes over decades, sometimes not in this lifetime, in my view. Sometimes it goes on into the next realm. Now, we're going to look at all of this in some detail. By the way, we're going to look at how this works in Hinduism. Hinduism has the same 4 stages. Buddhism has the same 4 stages. The brain, science has the same 4 stages. Let's look at that for just 1 second. What are the different levels or layers of the brain? What's the most basic level of the brain? The reptilian, right? And what's it about? Egoic survival. And then wrapped around that is the limbic system, which is typically called, it's a second level, which is called the mammalian, because it prepares you to have empathy, to feel with and along with others, to be able to parent, to be able to be in society. So that second brain, that limbic brain, the mammalian brain, is our second stage, relational. And then around that is the large Anderson? No. That's a movie. Neocortex. And what does it do? It allows you to think, to wonder, to analyze, to dissolve, to take things apart, put them back together again. And then more and more scientists are coming out now, like Andrew Newberg, saying there's a 4th level to the brain called the God part of the brain. We'll look at that a little bit in class as well, that they're actually showing scientifically that there are parts of the brain in the parietal lobe that actually light up when people have mystical experiences. So the brain carries these 4 modes of consciousness. In the Bible, where do you suppose this 4th mode of consciousness is? In the New Testament. Genesis, ego. Exodus through Samuel, we go. Kings, poets, prophets, disintegration. New Testament, reintegration. Most of the people who come to my Bible class will say, I love the New Testament, but not the Old Testament so much. You know one of the reasons I think why that is? Because our spirituality has not embraced our egos, our we-goes, and our disintegrations. So the first part of the story is like, thank you very much. I don't care for that. I want to get right to the mystical. And when I leave this church and go out into the SHIT of the world and my ego, I can't wait to get back to church so I can find God. What if God is in those moments of ego, in those relationships you're in, and in those neuroses you're struggling with? What if? What if? What would that do with your spiritual paradigm? Would it make it bigger? Oh, and then I will be done. We got one more box here. What are we going to call this? In our view, the ego, the we-go, the disintegration, the reintegration are all blended together. That's why I liked your analogy of the blender. And in Hebrew, Christian, many other mythologies, it's all blended together. So your ego, your relationships, your neuroses, addictions, insanities, and your mystical experiences are all blended into one spiritual cocktail, put together, and what's the result? You. The unique you. In fact, there's a word for this 5th combination of all the other 4. It's called quintessential. Have you heard quintessential? What's quinta? 5. Quintessence. The essence of blending the four together, this is an alchemical idea as well, the idea of blending the four together gives you the quintessential you. Isn't that beautiful? So your ego, all relationships, all insanities, and all mystical experiences are all blended together to present this amazingly frickin' weird, odd, exciting, unique person called you. Now, I'm supposed to do a meditation here, so let's do the quintessential meditation. I invite you to take your meditative posture, whatever that is for you. Often it's closing the eyes so we can symbolically go into that realm that holds the ego, all of our relationships, all of our private insanities, all of our private mystical experiences. So take a breath. 2 or 3 maybe. Very deep, deliberate breaths. And let your body relax. This morning in the meditation, I would like to just address the Holy One as many presences. Infinite One, we recognize you as the little I ams that comprise each person in this room. Each little unique spark of the infinite. We also recognize you as those sparks come together in relationships with houses and cars and food and clothing and work and play and people and ideas and politics. And we recognize all of those combinations of sparks as you. And then we recognize that when the sparks fly, the friction, the conflicts, the bumping up, the disagreement, self-judgment, other judgment, all those experiences that take us apart, we recognize your presence in those as well. And then we assert faith, reliance, especially in that time of disintegration, reliance that somehow, somewhere, some way, there is a power greater than me that will put it together again. Is putting it together again. But I don't understand why it's this way. Faith. And if you say, it's a bunch of BS, great. Enjoy it. And again, in faith, we recognize that you are bringing all of this to the quintessential self, the quintessential relationships, the quintessential cosmos, where all this stuff is blended together into something we all sense, and that is things ought to be better than they are. In this view, that's what they are becoming. Take a breath. And so it is.